Welcome everyone. This is taking TypeScript to the next level with Power Apps. It's really good to see all these faces on this slide, even though we're not together. I'm going to pretend like we are. I see some people that I know in attendance, and I'll just pretend that they're actually listening to this recorded session as well. So thank you for coming. Before we get started, do want to take an opportunity to thank our sponsors. There we go. These companies have helped put this event on, and I also want to special thanks, obviously, to the individuals who have organized this event. It's a lot different than last year when it was in person, and I'm sure the logistics are, and relearning some of the logistics for this event have been a lot of work. So thank you to everyone. Thank you to these sponsors for sticking with us, even as a virtual conference. I'm Michael Ochs. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I work for Excellence. We're a small shop out of Washington, D.C. area, and I'm a consultant and developer. If you want to get in touch with me, follow me on Twitter. There's my Twitter handle, Mike Factorial. Our agenda today, and as I mentioned, I'm gonna move pretty quickly through these slides. We've got a lot to cover in the 45 minutes that we have together on the demo side of things. But this session it's intended for audiences that are not familiar with TypeScript, that may be looking to get started with TypeScript on a Power Apps Dataverse project. So we're going to level set at the beginning. We're going to talk about what TypeScript is and why we should be using TypeScript and what the benefits of using TypeScript are. And then we're going to actually jump into getting started with TypeScript. We're going to have a pretty simple use case for TypeScript that we're going to look at. But I think, we're going to take it from the perspective of getting, your first sort of TypeScript project. And then we're going to build upon that TypeScript project to use things like modules and get code reuse. We're also going to add unit tests to our TypeScript project. And then ultimately what we're going to do, assuming we have time, is actually put those, build that project inside of Azure Devops and run our unit tests against it and things like that, so we can see the full ALM process using TypeScript. All right, so what is TypeScript? So TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript. It is a transpiled language. So you write TypeScript and there's a transpiler, not a compiler, that actually converts your TypeScript into plain old JavaScript. TypeScript is a type-safe language, so you get transpile time errors. So if you make a mistake in your TypeScript, the transpiler will let you know about it, unlike JavaScript, where you're kind of flying blind a lot of times. So it's type safe so that there are type libraries for Dataverse and Power Apps specifically, so that you kind of get all that goodness of the IDE giving you IntelliSense and things like that, and we'll see that in the demo. TypeScript is community supported and open source. The type libraries or type definitions and things like that are contributed to by the community. A lot of the type libraries for Dataverse obviously were written by people in the community. Daryl Labar, Scott Juro, among others, have credit on the type definitions. There's also, as I mentioned, there's unit test frameworks out there. Those are also supported by the community. So if you want to contribute and kind of give back, or if you find areas of improvement, you can do that since it's open source. All right, so why do we want to use TypeScript? Well, I already mentioned a couple of reasons. The IDE support is far better than JavaScript. So you do get IntelliSense, you do get compile time or transpile time errors. TypeScript is an object-oriented language, so it's very familiar to those of you who come from a C# or a Java background, and we'll see some of that in the demo. Broad industry usage, TypeScript's not going anywhere, and it's kind of growing in our space as well as other spaces, and it's becoming sort of an industry standard, or at least in our industry, it's becoming a standard for doing client-side scripting and things like that. So you probably want to get on board at this point. Better readability, we'll see that when we start to dive into the demo. It's cleaner. You get that code reuse. So when we look at how we're going to use modules in the demo, you'll see that you can sort of split things out into different files and things like that. So you don't have a massive JavaScript file that you're trying to read into your Power Apps forms and things like that. All right, so with that, I'm actually going to go ahead and jump into the demo. If there's any questions along the way, since this is recorded, I will be listening in and answering questions as we go along, so feel free to chat them as they come up. All right, so we're going to start over here in our model-driven app. I have an app. It's got customers in it. It's got accounts and contacts. We've got if I pop this form open, you'll see that up at the top, we've got this notification that's saying basically, hello world. This is, the contact's name. So it's pulling the contact's name off of the form. It's displaying it up here in the header. If that's important to your customers, maybe it would be. Maybe it would be some important value, like this is a very important customer. This might be a VIP, and that flag is buried down here somewhere, and they want to see that at the top of the form. So maybe that's a better use case. But for this one, sort of a hello world. But we'll see what that looks like here in a second in JavaScript, and then subsequently in TypeScript. All right. So to get started with this, I do have a sample project up on GitHub that you can download and kind of follow along with this recording. We're going to go ahead and we'll replicate this. Let's clone it down to, I'm just going to clone it with Visual Studio. And it's going to actually do 2019, but we're going to work primarily in VS Code today because it's a little bit simpler to work with TypeScript projects in VS Code. So I'll go ahead and I'll clone this down locally. All right, that's done. We're kind of done with Visual Studio at this point. Let's get out of there. And let me see, I had this open before, but let's open the one we just downloaded. All right. Okay. So the banner that we just saw in our model-driven app, this is essentially all the JavaScript that's required to do that, to implement that functionality. And you can see it's about 5 lines of code. It is about 5 lines of code. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. If you needed this sort of functionality, you could roll this JavaScript pretty simply. But you're not going to get, and again, it's a simple use case. So 5 lines of code you may not want to go to the trouble of using TypeScript, but when things start to get more complicated, the benefits of TypeScript will sort of come out. But what we can see here is we've got our execution context coming in here, but if I were to do execution context.get, right? So execution.get, we know that there's a get form context on here. Unfortunately, the IDE has no idea that there's a get form context, and that kind of the issue there is that you a lot of times have to go back out to the documentation unless you have it memorized. So you're not getting sort of that nice IDE experience where you're getting the IntelliSense, and it's telling you what these things are. So I could very easily fat finger this and say it's get forms context, and I'm not going to get any errors until I actually push this out and test it in my app. So if we look at what this looks like in TypeScript, jump over here, and actually let's look at this one first. So that's our module, but this is our sort of generic TypeScript example of that same JavaScript. And again, it's 5 lines of code, but what you'll notice is now we've got some strong typing in here, right? So we know what an event context is. We actually don't, because the first thing we need to do is there. So while that's installing, let's take a look at a couple of things here. So while that's installing, there's quite a few packages, and there's a number of dependent packages, so this will take a little while to get everything installed. Oh, actually finished pretty quickly this time. Let's look at our package.json. So within here, we're kind of setting up some of our scripts. This is our script to build, our script to clean the project. We've got a parcel dev and parcel prod in here. We're going to look at that later when we get to start using modules and how we use parcel. We've got a test which runs our Jest tests. The Jest is a testing framework that was developed by Facebook that we're going to use. But down here under our dev dependencies, we have our type definitions. So these are the packages that npm will install for us. We've got our Jest types. We've got our sign-in types. So sign-in is a mocking framework that we're going to use alongside of Jest in our unit tests. We've got our typestat/xrm. These are the type definitions I was talking about earlier that are maintained by the community, that have all the type definitions for Dataverse, Power Apps, forms, and things like that. We've got our Jest libraries and our sign-in libraries. That's that mocking framework. We've got our obviously TypeScript in here, and an XRM mock. So XRM mock is what we're going to use for our unit tests as well. And this is another mocking framework so that you can actually unit test TypeScript without actually deploying to your Power Apps environment. We've got parcel. Again, as I mentioned, we're going to look at what parcel is and how we can use that when we get into creating modules. And then we got our TypeScript for Jest as well. All right, so let's jump back over to our contact form.generic. As I mentioned, so our squiggly lines have gone away now because we did the npm install and it installed our XRM types. So we can look at this, and we can actually, instead of the way it was before, which was in our JavaScript, you could actually you had no IntelliSense. If we were to say start from blank here and say let context equal execution context, so you can see we're already getting the IntelliSense. Hit tab, and now you can see we can actually see what all of the methods are on that execution context. So I can say get form context, and if you generally want to strongly type these things. So in this case, you can actually see that this returns a type of xrm.form context. Right. So if I were to say any for this, any is sort of the catch-all. And then I were to come down here and say form context dot, I'm not going to get the IntelliSense. So we do want that. Say XRM form context now. Right, I've got all the methods that are available in form context. So this is pretty generic. So I can actually build this. If I go reveal my scripts here, click build. Should build without a problem. All right, so that finished building. Now if we go up under TS output, and you can find where this is output. This is in your TS config. So your outdir is where it ultimately puts it. Let's go to TS output, and now we've got a contact form.js, and that's not the one, contact form.generic. Okay, so this is the output of our TypeScript file. You can see that it looks very familiar. It looks almost identical to our contact form.js that we looked at in the beginning, with a couple of things added here. So use strict, that's defined in your ts.config as well. And then we've got our 5 lines of code again, and a reference to our map file. So what a map file is essentially used by the browser or the IDE to allow you to debug TypeScript while running JavaScript. So the code that's going to run in the browser, code that's going to run in our IDE, is actually this JavaScript code, but ultimately what you want to be able to do is step through your TypeScript code, and these map files are what allow you to do that. So anytime JavaScript gets transpiled, there's a map file that goes along with that that allows for debugging TypeScript. All right, so let's go ahead and take this and we'll put it into, so here's our contact form.js. This was the generic one that we looked at in the beginning. Go ahead and paste that in, save it, let's update and publish, and if all goes well, this should continue to work as it was before. So okay, there we go. All right, so that's sort of the generic contact form, but so we did get the sort of IntelliSense, we got the IDE integration, we get our transpile time error checking. So again, we do the same thing here, and I say get forms context, try to build that. Oh, sorry, that's our JS. Let me go back to our TS. Right, so get forms context. Right, so now it gives me real-time feedback on that's not actually I figured that, and that's not actually a method on this on execution context. All right, so but let's say, for instance, that our client is super happy with what we've developed thus far, and they'd actually like to take it a step further, and they want to use this all over the place in their app. Right? They just love it. It's amazing. It's a game changer for them. So they want to see the record's name at the top in a little yellow bar, and they want to see that on all their forms. What we could do is we could take this, our contact form.generic, we could come over here and create an account form.ts, right? And then all we have to do is, let's say this is account name, and instead of first name, it's name, right? And that would be sufficient. But we're not getting any code reuse here, so what we would like to do is kind of abstract this away so that we can reuse the code that we've already written in our contact form. So how do we do that? Well, we've got this form common class down here, and you can see now we're getting into the concept of using modules. So we have a class that we're exporting, and anytime you export a class in TypeScript, it becomes a module that can be imported by other TypeScript files or classes. So in this case, we're doing we're actually getting the form context off the execution context that's being passed in. This looks very familiar. It's kind of the same thing that we did in our generic TypeScript. And then we're getting the entity name and the primary field value that's going to be passed in from our specific TypeScript file. And then we're setting the form notification here. So if we look at our contact form.ts now, you'll see we've gotten rid of all the specific code for this contact form, and now we're actually importing this module, this form common module. And on that form common module, these are all static methods. You can do inheritance; they don't have to be well. As far as putting these into a form, they do need to be static. We're not going to be instantiating a contact form instance and then calling methods on it. We're going to be calling them directly, statically. So that's why everything in here is static. But you can do, obviously, you can do inheritance and abstract classes and things like that in TypeScript. But anyway, all we're doing here is calling that form common on load with the execution context and the specific field that we want to pull off and display in the banner. If we go to the account form.ts, very similar, right? Almost identical, except in this case, it's the name field that we want to pull. So we've got some code reuse there. Obviously, again, you can see exactly what it is that this thing wants, right? Some execution context. It wants primary field name, which is name, and we should. And I misspelled it. So thank you for that. I did it again. All right. So I'll go ahead and build this. I already built it, but just for good measure. And now if we go to our TS output and look at contact form.js, we'll see that this looks very different from what it looked like before, right? In our generic case, it was pretty much looked like what we'd expect. But now that we've introduced the concept of modules into this, we're getting, we've got a lot more going on here. And it looks a little bit dissimilar from what we're used to, right? We've got this exports ES module. We got this exports.contact form down here, which is pointing to our contact form class, right? And then ultimately it's calling form common on load. So if I were to take this, right, and let's go ahead and drop this into here. As is, this isn't going to work. For one, it's gonna choke on this particular line, but then it's going to continue to choke because it doesn't know what form common is. Form common isn't a web resource in our project currently. So if we just save, we'll update publish, and just to prove it out, we'll go ahead and F5 this now. So it loads the latest. There we go. All right. So web resource method on load doesn't exist. So something happened along the way here when we introduced modules that it no longer even recognizes that we have a on load function in our JavaScript file. So how do we get around this? The way that we get around this is to use a bundler. So we want to include all the module definitions, including what's in the form common in our single JavaScript file that we're going to ultimately deploy to Power Apps. And the way that you do that is with a bundler. For those of you who are familiar with client-side scripting, there's bundlers out there like Webpack that are very powerful, and you can use them to bundle up not just not just TypeScript files, but you can use them to bundle up entire websites with all of the the specific resources that for a web web page needs, for example. So if you've got JavaScript, you've got CSS, you've got other resources that are included in your web page. The bundler will kind of take all of those things and put them into one place so that you can deploy it as a single package. So the bundler that we're using in this project is called Parcel, and there's a couple of different bundlers out there, but the reason that we're using Parcel in this case is that it's super simple to set up and configure. Webpack, for example, has a lot more capabilities and a lot more configurability, but for our particular use case, we don't need all of that extra configuration, and Parcel actually worked really good to get set up pretty quickly with. So if we go back to our package.json, you'll remember we looked at these two lines, these two scripts, and what these two scripts are doing. We have a parcel dev and a parcel prod. It's these scripts are calling the parcel runtime, which was installed as one of our packages down here, and we've got one for dev and one for prod. The difference between the two is that the dev has no minify on it. The prod does have minify. One of the things that happens as a result of using modules and Parcel and things like that is that the files get a little bit larger than they would if you were just writing straight JavaScript. So the minify comes into play when you want to push it out to a production environment, and you don't want all of that. You don't want all that overhead. So you want to get it to be as small as possible in your production environment. But I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do a parcel dev, and we'll see what that looks like when it parcels up all of our JavaScript. There we go. So it actually went through. It went through all of our JS files and parceled those up. It's putting it into this parcel dist dev folder. So we go here and we look at our contact form JS now. So there's our parceled up JavaScript version of what we looked at a minute ago. And this obviously, we took what was 5 lines of code, and it's now still 5 lines of code, but it's 5 lines of some, pretty involved code. If we were to kind of format this, it would be many more than 5 lines of code. So again, getting back to the prod versus dev, you can kind of see in here that we've got, if we do form common, right? So here's our exports form common. So we've actually got pretty much all of the code in here. If we do get value, you'll see that, right? So the form common is actually packed in with our contact form.js now. So we've got something that we can actually put into a web resource and run on a form. So let's do that. Over here. And we'll publish that. So I need to actually go in and update one more thing here. So let's see if I can find my form. Forms, contacts. So we actually have to update how we're calling this. One thing I didn't mention that I should have was in our package.json. So one of the parameters for parcel is a global namespace. So in this case, I'm using MF for like factorial. If you were to take this project and want to run it in your environment, you probably want to change that global namespace to be something like if it's your company, excellence or something like that, and that'll just avoid That'll avoid conflicts, naming conflicts. So my global namespace happens to be MF. So in order to call this, I actually need to go to events on my form and come back over here. So this is what our function was calling previously, was that onload. What we want to call is mf.contactForm.onload. This being the class, the module that we created, we exported. And then onload is the method. Save and publish that. Right. There we go. All right. So now we're kind of back where we started, but in this case, we now have code reuse. You know, we've got readability. It keeps doing that. There it is. We've got better readability, code reuse. We've got our IntelliSense and IDE integration and build time errors and things like that. So just to take this the next step, so what our client was asking for is for us to specifically put this on all forms. So I'm going to throw this in on the contact form as well. And if we go to accountform.js, let's just go ahead and create a new resource. It's a script. All right, paste that in, save it, update and publish. Now let's go back to our account entity. You can see, as of right now, if I load this up, I'm not getting the banner. Form. There we go, and then onload. So in this case, we're mf.accountform.onload, passing the execution parameter, save and publish. All right. There we go. Okay. So, customer's happy. We've added this to all the forms. Now the customer comes back and says, "Hey, you know what we need? We need code coverage results. We need to make sure that we have unit tests in place for all of this code that you're writing, all this wonderful code that you're putting in place in our system." So let's go ahead and make that happen. And the way that we're going to make that happen in this project is we're going to write unit tests in Jest. So if we come over here under our, let's see, so now under parcel, under source tests, you can see we already have a couple of tests in here for our account form and our contact form. I didn't go to much trouble to show code reuse in this example. You could do this sort of same thing that we did in our actual TypeScript files, but for these it's pretty similar. You can see that it's, in this case we're importing the account form, we're describing the account form. In this case it's the contact form, describing the contact form. We've got a test initializer in here, so here's an example of some code reuse in our unit tests. We're importing an XRM mock framework. This is a TypeScript library that has the sort of mocked up methods that the SDK client has, so that you can do sort of similar functions without ever having to deploy into a Power Apps instance and to do your testing. So it mocks up a lot of the creating a form and views and things like that for you. Like I said, account form, test initializer. If we look at test initializer, we are using, so the first thing that we're doing is we're initializing the mock generator with an entity name. So it's essentially, kicking off what type of form this is going to be, or what type of test this is going to be for what type of entity. Down here we have a sign-in stub. So this is the mocking framework that I mentioned when we were looking through the package.json that allows you to sort of intercept calls. And the XRM mock does a pretty good job of mocking up the majority of the things in the SDK client. However, there are things that it doesn't, either it doesn't mock, and if you were to want to update that, you could do a pull request into XRM mock to get that fixed. Or you can use something like sign-in to stub out the things that are missing or aren't necessarily adequate for what you're trying to test. And in our case, set form notification is mocked on XRM mock. However, it's not, there's no way to get once you set a form notification in XRM mock, there's no way to actually get anything back from it, like a value or the message or whatever. It just kind of goes into the ether. So what we want to do is actually we stub out this set form notification. And what that does is it calls a function that essentially adds, the set form notification takes a message and it takes a unique ID, returns a Boolean. What this mock is doing is just taking that unique ID and message and adding it to a map up here, or what is basically a dictionary with a string and string, or name and value pair. If we go back to contact form, you'll see we're calling this on a before each. There's a before all as well in here. So if you want to call something once for all of your tests, you do a before all. If you want to call it each time that a test is executed, you would do a before each. And then we're sort of setting up our test here. This is what it should do. And then we're creating an instance of an event context, a mocked up event context that we ultimately need to push or pass into our onload method. We're adding a new attribute. So this is how you create what would be fields on your form. So in our case, we got a first name field that we're going to be pulling off with a value of Mike. There's a create string, there's a create lookup, there's a create pick list, etc. that you can use to that you can use to sort of mock out your form that you're going to be testing. And then we call contact form onload with our event context. We expect that there will be one notification in our map that we created in test initializer, and we expect that the value should contain Mike. And then over on the account form test side, same thing, except in this case, we're creating a different field, and we're expecting that it should contain excellence. So with that, we can build this again. And we can set a breakpoint on this. Let's say we want it to be there. And let's run our tests. Oh, okay, well, I ran it. We didn't debug it. So it did pass. We got 2 total tests. You can actually see the output here. But let's go ahead and start debugging so we can actually see us stepping through the code. All right, so it didn't actually stop on my breakpoint, which is odd. Let's see, let's put one there, and let's go ahead and continue. Oh, now it did stop on it, thank you. All right, so we can actually see that we're, we've got all the IntelliSense at runtime, at debug time as well, and we can actually drill into some of these objects. So like, for instance, form context should have, go to context, and go to, that's not it, form context. data. Maybe it's under UI. There we go. UI controls. You can see we've got one item in our item collection. That's because we added it up here. If we wanted to drill down into our account form, TypeScript, which is here. Set a breakpoint here, and for some reason it keeps wanting to go to a different line. And then we can actually see this running. So we can go to form comment as well, drill down even deeper. Let's go ahead and continue. All right, let's just continue on here. There we go. All right, so our test passed. All right, so we've got tests for our code. We want to actually get that in front of the customer. So the customer requested that we, show some metrics on our testing, unit testing of this project. So in order to do that, what we're going to do next is actually go into Azure Devops and and build this project in Azure Devops and run the tests against it. So let's go to dev.azure. And you can see I've got a pipeline demo set up here already. Pipelines, and I've got one from a while back that we'll just take a look at real quick. Go to jobs. You can see 100% of our tests passed for this one. This is actually pulling the code straight out of my GitHub repo. It's building it with npm install and build, and then it's running our npm test as well. So you can see that here, contact form.test, contact form or account form.test. So how do we set this up? Let's go create a new pipeline, and we'll select GitHub as our repo. So we're going to pull this code directly out of the Power Apps TypeScript sample in GitHub. And I'm going to use the Node.js template for this. So this kind of gets us started with the npm install and build. The only other thing that we want to add here is we want to actually add our tests. So there we go. Pasted that in. You can also do this from, if you save this, you could click save here, and I'll show you. Save that. So you can also get these tasks out of the task list. If I was to come in here and edit this here, right? So if I wanted to search for specific tasks, I could do that from here. That's good. Let's go ahead and run this. Looks good. All right, that's queued. If we step down into this or drill down into this, you'll see it's actually running. So it's going to go out to GitHub. It's going to pull down our the latest code off of that repo, and then it's going to do the install and build and then run our tests. And give that 1 second. Okay, it's running our tests. 100% of tests passed. Here's our report. Good. So we've pretty much got an end-to-end solution now. We've got our test results published. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. All right. So what did we talk about? Talked about what TypeScript is and why we should use it. I think we demonstrated the benefits of using TypeScript for a Power Apps project. I think the sample app that I put up there, again, a simple use case, but an easy way to get started if you're looking for a starting point. And with that, if there's any additional questions or time, I just want to say thank you and have a great Summit 2021.